afternoon. It's great to talk to you today. My name is Dr Cassandra Schefe and I'm a soil scientist with an organisation called AgriSite, working with you today on behalf of the North East Catchment Management Authority and Partners in Ag as part of the National Carbon Farming Outreach Program. So what we'll talk through today is some of the background behind why carbon is such a big deal at the moment and what that means in terms of the global perspective, and then what's happening on farm and how we can actually support and show how good Australian farming is currently doing. So today we'll talk through some of the sinks and sources of carbon in agriculture. We'll then come right back up to the global perspective of why carbon is such a big deal. We'll talk through this thing called scopes, which is some new terminology that's coming through. Then we'll talk through some of the key levers responsible for emissions on farm, which is our loss of carbon to the atmosphere. We'll touch on some of the calculators, talk through why productivity is sort of the key thing. Good farming is really what we're out to do. And then kind of come right back down to how soil carbon works and why we may not be able to do all the great and wonderful things that we'd like to do with our soils to improve our soil carbon values. So first of all, you've probably all seen this before, but this is what we'd call the carbon cycle in agriculture. So this is around where carbon as an element and part of our system moves through the landscape. So the key things that we look at here are, first of all, the fact that there's carbon in the atmosphere through CO2 or carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide then can move into the plant through what's called photosynthesis, which is a very important process here. And as part of that photosynthesis cycle, that carbon dioxide is then converted into sugars in the plant, and this is then moved into other bits to help plants grow. Fundamentally, through the plant is the only way that we can bring carbon from the atmosphere as CO2 down into our soil. Because then once the plant dies and all the roots and that are there already, that carbon that's in that plant material then gets converted into different types of soil carbon. And this is all done through the breakdown through microbial decomposition or microbes in the soil. So this is where the fungi and the bacteria in the soil really get in and munch through all that plant material and create what we'd call organic matter or decomposed residues in that system. If that process results in a discrete increase in carbon in our soils, then we can say that we've got carbon sequestration or carbon capture. But there's a lot of things going on, so that might not always happen. The other things that happen in the carbon cycle are when cows or sheep eat their grass that's captured the carbon through photosynthesis. Then obviously there's manure that comes out, but a really important thing that happens is that when cows actually burp, and livestock and sheep as well, because of the way that their stomachs are set up, they actually release a lot of gas through the breakdown of the grass within their gut. So that carbon dioxide and methane, which is what's here known as the CH4, and the carbon dioxide is the CO2, that gets released back into the air, and that can also increase the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases like methane in the atmosphere. At the same time, then we've got livestock which create the milk and the meat and wool and other byproducts from animals. And then we've got all these things going on. So I'd like to just focus a bit more on this photosynthesis piece and just reinforce the fact that photosynthesis is the way that all carbon in the soil comes into the soil in the first place. So it's that conversion from atmospheric carbon dioxide into sugars in the plant, which then get converted into all these other compounds that create the plant and make it grow. The other thing that happens, the other way that carbon can get into our soil is obviously then when animals eat the plant and redeposit it through manure. Now, I've said here that this isn't a perfect process because what we know is that the microbes in the system, if we go back to the carbon cycle piece, the microbes responsible for breaking down that plant material into soil carbon, they actually, like us, they actually breathe in oxygen and they breathe out carbon dioxide. So as much as we want a lot of microbes in our system and we want a really functioning soil environment, that process itself results in the release of carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So not all the carbon that comes through the plant into the soil or through the animal manure into the soil stays there. A lot of that gets broken down and released back up to the air. So we just need to keep in mind that this process isn't a perfect process. So there's a lot of other things happening that mean that we don't get all the carbon into the soil that we think we might be getting. Now, so we've known how we get carbon into the soil, or how we get carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the soil through the plant. Now I'd just like to step right back up to the global picture to kind of talk through why it's important to start thinking about carbon in our soils and start thinking about the emissions or the loss of carbon from our systems through carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So sometimes I know it seems a bit weird that here we are as, we're in our small towns in the Wimmera, doing our thing, but how these global influences can actually impact kind of what we're doing and how we go about it into the future. So at a global level, there's a lot of worldwide emphasis on reducing greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere because we want to try and limit the amount of global warming that's happening. As part of this, there's global expectations around what can be done to reduce the impact of increased greenhouse gas emissions. And a key part of that is what's called the IPCC. So that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is the group that work through to work out what's possible and what can be done and what kind of targets are feasible and where the world pretty much needs to go. A key part of the next piece from that is what's called the Paris Agreement, which is when all these countries got together and made commitments around what can be done to reduce global warming and reduce the amount of emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And then there's these things called the COP meetings, one of which was held recently in Dubai, and that's where all the countries get together and talk about how well they're doing and what they can do better and where their next targets need to be. At a country level then, every government really then makes commitments around what they're going to do. And the Australian government has made commitments to reduce the net emissions from Australia in line with their commitments and targets to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So at a first level, the government is trying to do things to reduce emissions and reduce global warming. That then filters down. So within each of the sectors of the ag industry, so grains, livestock, horticulture, wine, fisheries, all those different industries, each sector has set either ambitions or goals or targets around how that sector could contribute to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. This then, of course, flows through to the farmers and related industries in agriculture, who are then encouraged to support those targets that the sectors have set. At the other perspective, actual companies have also made commitments around reducing their greenhouse gas footprints in their company systems. And this can result in large multinational companies making commitments or requirements around how they can reduce their emissions in their supply chains. The next thing that can be happening is what's called the SBTI, where it's an organisation called the Science Based Targets Initiative, which works with companies to define what they can do in terms of reducing the emission footprint within their companies and kind of the pathway in line with that. So you can see then every company is sourcing raw materials and products from Australian farmers, which means that those farmers are then having to start to look at what companies are needing in terms of their requirements for reporting in addition to what might be happening through the ag sectors. At this level, whilst we're talking about, commitments and reporting requirements and stuff, it's still very much a voluntary or a nice to have approach in Australia. This is all changing at the moment with what's called the mandatory reporting of greenhouse gas emissions within the Australian system. So this means that the Australian government has now said that big companies, large multinational companies or even large Australian companies, need to start reporting the emission footprint of their businesses. At this point, it's easy to say, well, they're large companies, that's their problem, it's not really anything to do with us. But what we know is that companies and everything that they produce in terms of the food and products and everything else don't exist in isolation. So they all have there's always other companies down the chain and then farmers producing that food that are going to start to get impacted by this. But the key shift now is, rather than being kind of more of a voluntary, nice to have approach in terms of emission reporting, it's going to become mandatory. So this means that there will only be an increasing requirement to report emissions through the landscape. When I talk landscape, I'm talking supply chains and broader piece. So just to focus back, emissions are important in reporting because they're demonstrating the greenhouse gas release or footprint of each of these companies and countries, which then contribute to increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that then result in increased global warming. So this whole global picture is around understanding where things sit in terms of emissions at the moment, and then opportunities to reduce those as possible. As I mentioned, each of the agricultural sectors have their own plans and targets around what they can do with emissions. So these are all listed here, so including the beef and sheep. There's a few different roadmaps and sustainability plans. And then in the Grains Research and Development Corporation have done work as well. And then there's, obviously all the other sectors there as well. So this is just to say that this isn't just a small thing. This is something that all of Australian agriculture is working through and understanding what opportunities there are to recognise good that farmers are doing at the moment and how we can report those through. When we talk about reporting of emissions and the importance of big companies doing their thing and what that means for the other parts of the supply chain, this is kind of where it all starts to get real. So I've mentioned the word scope before. So scope 1, 2 and 3 refer to different buckets of emissions that companies need to report on. This will all become very important in a second. We start to explain what happens in agriculture. So when we talk about scope 1 emissions, they're emissions from within an operation. So if you're a food manufacturing company, then your emissions are everything that happens within that factory to create that food. If you're a farmer, your scope 1 emissions are everything that you control on farm. So scope 1 is effectively everything within your control as a business. Scope 2 emissions are the indirect emissions from generating electricity, steam, heat or cooling. It's only a smaller part of the supply chain and it's a very discrete aspect of work. It tends to be something that farmers don't really have to worry about. Scope 3 emissions are all indirect emissions that occur prior to your business. So if you're a food manufacturer, it's all your pre-factory emissions that come through. If you're a farmer, it's the manufacture of fertiliser and chemicals. So just to step this through, you can understand kind of the magnitude of what we're talking about. On the right-hand side here, we have an example of different parts of the supply chain, from the manufacturing of the fertiliser and chemicals that are used on farm, through to the farming operation, through to the aggregator or the bulk handler. This might be by Terra in Horsham or GrainCorp, or it might be another buyer of product. Then you might have your processor, and then your food manufacturer, and then your retailer. So this is a very simple supply chain, let's say for grain or for wheat, barley, canola, for example. So what's important in terms of our scope reporting is that if you're a farmer, your scope 3 is the manufacturing. So it's the emissions associated with the creation of the products that you use on farm. As you go down then, the aggregator, scope 3, is the farm and the chemical manufacturing. If you're a processor, it's all the prior things. If you're a food manufacturer, it is everything prior. It's like a snowballing effect. Everything that happens before you is your scope 3. And the reason for this is so that then when you get down to the retailer and you have a product on the shelf, that food manufacturing company can report on the total emissions or the carbon dioxide equivalents or carbon input into the whole creation of that product. That's why it's a completely snowballing accumulation effect. So this demonstrates the importance of scope 3. And as you get down the supply chain towards the food manufacturer, there's more and more scope 3 emissions involved. So why are farmers copping so much angst around this? Why is farming important in this whole scope 3 reporting piece? And the challenge we have is that when you get down to the food or beverage manufacturer position in that supply chain, up to 90% of the emissions associated with the creation of that food are in the scope 3, okay? So everything before the manufacturing piece, it's up to 90% of what goes into that product. The next thing that's important is that the agricultural food production, so what happens on farm, can contribute up to 90% of those scope 3 emissions. So if we go back to our supply chain description here, not only, if you're a food manufacturer, not only is most of your impact coming before you, so 90% of what goes into food manufacturing is in that, pre-supply chain, but 90% of that is actually from the farmer perspective. So what happens on farm has a massive impact on the total emissions associated with that product. The other reason why this is really important is that at a federal government level, agricultural emissions are the second largest emissions behind energy. So if we have a look at that, we can see, if we look at the whole total emissions of the Australian economy, as reported in the National Inventory Report, which is where the government reports on the total emissions across the country, we can see that while energy is a massive part of that, the next part behind that is agriculture. And I know that there is a lot happening in the energy space to reduce those emissions. And as that happens, more and more emphasis will come on to agriculture as a big deal. If we have a look at this emission chart, we can also see that industrial processes and product use are a player, and then waste management is there. And then there's this last thing called LULCF, which is land use change, and forestry. And this is actually where there's activities in the Australian landscape through tree plantings and other things that are actually net sequestering carbon. So they're offsetting the things that are happening in the other sectors. So biodiversity and planting trees on farm is a really big deal. Retiring unproductive lands into other sectors is important. And obviously forestry is a big deal in this place in terms of the use of trees to capture carbon. Now, there's been quite a lot of discussion or social pressure around driving emissions on farm to zero, or what's called net zero or carbon neutral farming. And it's something that's been quite a big topic of conversation. But something really to keep in mind with this is that, well, as we know, agriculture can contribute up to 90% of the scope 3 emissions. But the reason for that is the fact that agriculture is the only part of that supply chain which is actually creating something. Farmers are the only ones who are taking these raw materials, adding soil, rain, our environment, and creating food. So that's why it's literally called primary production. primary being the first point of creation in terms of our food. So we can see that before farming, fertilizer and chemical companies are taking raw materials and refining them into the products that we use on farm. And then after farm, every part of that supply chain is refining what's happening in agriculture. So you can see why a lot of the emission footprint is associated with farmers because of that food creation piece. So it's really important when we're talking about farming and what we're doing really well, that we talk about, sure, we can work on ways to reduce emissions, but we need to be managing expectations around net zero or carbon neutral ag because we have such a big play and importance in that whole supply chain. In terms of how we talk about emissions and we talk about, how much of each supply chain is in each piece and kind of how we work through emissions, we obviously need to use a framework or a calculator to actually start to understand what those numbers look like and what opportunities there might be to reduce those numbers. And as part of that, there's a whole list of different calculators that have been developed in order to start understanding the emission footprint of different agricultural systems. I can see here that there's a dairy greenhouse gas accounting framework, there's sheep and beef framework, there's cropping, there's a feedlot one, sugar, cotton, horticulture, pork, buffalo, deer, goats, poultry, rice, and there's even one for wild food fisheries. I can see that all the ways that we create food and fibre are accounted for under these systems. I won't go through them today because it's quite a bit of detail involved, but the links are certainly there. And for teachers looking to have a bit of a play and understand these calculators, they're certainly really valuable. So when you actually click into these are Excel spreadsheets, which means that they're very easy to use with a lot of different informative material associated with them. Now, while calculators in an Excel spreadsheet are really easy to use, it also means that they can be quite clunky. And there's also could be connection in terms of farmers doing more than one different enterprise. And we know that mixed farming is a key part of our Australian farming systems. So because of this, all the different industry bodies got together to develop a web-based calculator that pulls together all the information in those Excel spreadsheets into something that's a bit easier to use online. So this is something else that might be of interest to explore within the classroom, and even create some dummy accounts and just start to put some numbers in and to see what magnitude of impact they have. So this web-based engine is actually supported under what's called Agricultural Innovation Australia, which is an organisation that was set up and is run by the different levy-paying industry sector organisations such as GRDC, Meat Livestock Australia, Sugar Research, all that kind of thing. So it's certainly worth having a bit of a play. And at the moment, this is the Australian standard for greenhouse gas accounting on farm. But having said that, we're still a long way to go in building kind of a comprehensive system of accounting that can be used between the different sectors of the supply chain. But as a starting point, this is a nice place to just have a look to see what's happening on your farm or on an average farm in the region, and just start to see where the key levers are and opportunities to potentially reduce those emissions. So talking about the biggest levers, let's have a look to see where our sources of emissions come from. So when you talk about levers, we talk about the key things in the system that if we change those, will have the biggest impact on those on-farm emissions. At the same thing, we also want to know which things aren't such a big deal, because if we put energy into reducing those, we could try really hard to do stuff and have very limited impact. So this pie chart here is at the Australian perspective. So this is a report that's done from the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, from their annual reporting. And this is on the whole of ag basis. Now this is also very high level. So this doesn't take into account what's happening in different regions. It's just kind of a big picture view of the whole country. The first thing that you can see here is that enteric fermentation is far and away the massive single source of emissions. So enteric fermentation, it's actually, it's a pretty big word. And what this basically means is it's the emissions associated with the burping of gas out of sheep and cattle, and this gas being high in greenhouse gases. So this enteric fermentation is due to the fact that sheep and cattle are what's called ruminants, which you've probably gone through in school. And as a ruminant, the way that they break down grass is through a heap of microbes in their gut, and it's the microbes that actually break down that grass and other feeds into something that the animals can use. And the effect of having these microbes in the system is that they actually release a lot of methane as part of their microbial breakdown of that grass. And it's this methane that's produced through this process of breaking down grass called enteric fermentation that is a massive part of the Australian ag emissions. And the reason why it's such a big deal is because we have so many sheep and cattle across our landscape, which is then why it's such a big deal. If you look at some of the other things that are important, manure management is a key player, and this is particularly with our feedlots and intensive and other intensive animal industries. The cultivation or growing of rice is only a small portion because rice is only a small crop in our systems. Agricultural soils is quite a big deal, and this is actually the processes, again, microbially based, that occur when residues and crops are grown and broken down into soils, and what happens when we have all our nutrient cycling and everything happening. Some of the gases that are produced under certain conditions in soil are also really strong greenhouse gas contributors. So nitrous oxide is something that's released in our agricultural soils when they get warm and wet, and there's a lot of nitrogen in the system, and this nitrous oxide also is a key driver behind that agricultural soils emissions bucket. The burning of residues or stubble burning is there as a small player as well. Then there's 2% of liming, and liming contributes into emissions purely because the reason why we use lime in agricultural systems is to ameliorate acid soils. So soils with a low pH value that we need to increase the pH of in order to continue growing really good crops. Now, the reason why this is part of this story is that lime, as a natural product that comes out of the ground, is something called calcium carbonate. When that calcium carbonate comes into contact with acid soils and it reacts to increase the pH of that soils and reduce the acidity, the byproduct reaction also releases carbon dioxide. And it's this carbon dioxide that is then released back into the atmosphere as an emission, as greenhouse gas. And then the use of urea in our soils at 2% is also important as a nitrogen source into some of our greenhouse gas emissions due to nitrogen cycling. And urea being a key fertiliser product that is used in our cropping systems. And not just a key fertiliser product, but it's a key nitrogen fertiliser. So it contributes incredibly well into plant growth, but it can come with emissions, and the creation of urea or the manufacture of it also has a high emission footprint. So once we've used these calculators and we come up with some key understanding of what's important in our systems or our key levers, we're going to get some numbers out of that. The first number that we'll get is a total emission number, and this is over a defined area within a defined time frame. So generally it's annual time, so it might be that this farm has an emission number of this number for this year. The other number that is really important for our supply chain reporting is what's called the emission intensity. And this is the reported value of emissions per a specific commodity unit, okay? So this is for if we grow 1 tonne of grain, there's a certain kilograms of CO2e or CO2 carbon dioxide equivalents for that tonne of grain. Or if we've got livestock, the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of meat, milk, wool, etc. So every commodity or every product that we export off farm has a carbon dioxide emission footprint with it. If we're looking to change these numbers, we're really looking to see what our key levers are that we can create that change. And the key focus on this is these numbers of emission intensity are effectively an efficiency number. So we've got a certain amount of inputs that go in to create certain outputs. If we can get better at growing more outputs for every unit of inputs, we're going to increase our efficiency. So if we have let's say we have 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents for 1 tonne of grain to grow a tonne of grain on a certain area of land. If we were able to double our yield, we would have the same amount of inputs over double the amount of grain, which means that the emissions per tonne would be half of what it was before. So it really is an efficiency perspective and doing things well to improve our offtake or our productivity in our systems. The two things to consider in any form of emission reporting is that any emission number that you might create from a calculator on farm is only valid for the season or the timestamp of that collection. So if numbers have been generated for a 2023 year, those numbers can't be used again in 24. They're only valid for the season of reporting. The other thing is, globally, there's very strong rules around how those numbers can be reported through the supply chain to ensure that the same number isn't getting used and misused across the industry or the supply chain. So if any farmers are interested in working through this, then there are very strong guidelines that have to be followed in order to report these emission numbers through the supply chain. So the next thing to think about is if we're looking at efficiency, we're really talking about the best way to reduce emissions on farm is to grow the best plant possible. And this then spreads those inputs across the greatest amount of outputs, or spreads those emissions across the greatest outputs. So going back, we know that our plant is the mechanism to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and bring it into the soil. So if we have the best plant possible, we can do that the best way we can. And then that also gives us the opportunity to create the best yield or productivity from that plant, which then spreads those emissions across those outputs. So the two key things we can look at is how we can identify and manage our soil constraints. So anything that's in our soils that might be stopping our plant from growing the best that it can. A key constraint that we know is soil acidity. This is across all our farming systems. Low pH soils or acid soils is a big deal across most of agriculture. When we have acid soils, our plants can't function properly. So if we can get rid of that acidity, we'll certainly increase our plant growth and increase our productivity and yield. Other constraints also include soil sodicity or dispersion, which is a constraint that can cause crusting on soil surfaces to stop the plants from growing up as they should. And then this dispersion can also stop water from infiltrating into the soil as well as it should. There's other constraints as well that could be considered, including compaction, slaking and other soil salinity, other toxicities involved. So really anything that stops that plant from growing well. The other thing to think about is how big the soil bucket is that the plants can access. So the key thing that we're looking for is to check that our rooting depth of our plants is as deep as it should be. We tend to assume that a lot of our cropping plants and all our pastures can actually have root systems that grow below 1 metre. If they're doing that, if they're getting below 1 metre, they're accessing a lot of water and nutrients and are able to grow really well. If they're not accessing all that because they've only got shallow roots, because there's an issue stopping them from growing, That then means that they're not able to capture all the water and they're not able to grow as well as they should. Once we've worked out what might be constraining or limiting our plant growth, we then need to maintain our system fertility in order to optimise the nutrients available for that crop. So in a lot of our agricultural systems, we tend to focus on just feeding the plant or the pasture or the crop to just what it needs in that season. But the best thing we can do to maximise the potential for that plant to grow is actually to maintain higher system fertility. And a key reason for this is that all our nutrients are interconnected. For example, it tends to be that nitrogen fertiliser is a key input into our farming systems, and plants need that to grow. It is the highest demand nutrient that they have. But plants can't take up nitrogen and use that well if they don't have the other nutrients in the system as well. So maintaining high levels of phosphorus, sulfur, potassium, etc. are required for that to do its job. So a key message in this space is to ensure that we have the other nutrients right before we can target our high yields with nitrogen. So setting the whole system up to grow well. Across our systems, there's some other key things that we can do to reduce our emission footprint. In our cropping base or our plant-based systems, that nitrogen usage is really important and using that efficiently. If we have a legume in the system, we're able to capture nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil for plant growth, which means that we have less reliance on nitrogen fertiliser. So that's really important. How we manage our residues or our crop stubbles, and that is also important, as is the use of nitrogen inhibitors or slow-release products, which have increased efficiency of uptake. And there's some other things we can do around how we increase biomass in our system. But any of those companion cropping or multi-species kind of things is really dependent on having the water in the system. And a lot of our Wimmera and Mallee environments just don't have enough water there to be able to use those kind of additional biomass options. But fundamentally, we're about growing the best plant that we can. In our livestock systems, there's some other things we can do to reduce emissions. So we reduce the age of our herds. So we have our animals maturing quicker because they can put on weight quicker. That means that they take less time to get to our target weights, and then they can move off into the next part of the supply chain. If we have animals in the system that are not calving or not breeding like they should, and they're not doing what they need to do, then taking those out of the system will help. If we have highly digestible feed and potentially supplements, that will also reduce our emission footprint. And now there's also opportunities for breeding for low emission. So certain genetics of animals are inherently more efficient at converting feed into meat and wool, etc., with less gassing coming out. Things like grazing management to utilise our pastures well and managing our manure as well are also super important. I've just also put a flag here that the words in italics are around farm activities that we know are really good to reduce emissions, but they're not yet accounted for in our emission calculators. So this means that we can't yet recognise the value of those activities through a reduced on-farm emission number. But at this point in time, it's really important to capture as much information as we can around our system, which then in time will come through in those calculator approaches. I'd like to finish up by focusing a bit more specifically on soil carbon as the key basis for any form of carbon capture and cycling in our system. What is soil carbon? So when we look at organic matter, which we'll define as the brown organic derived stuff in our soil that we can't see where it came from, so we can't see discrete plant structures in there, we would say that that is our organic matter. We tend to equate carbon and organic matter as the same thing, whereas in fact, if we look at this, there's carbon certainly in there, but there's other nutrients as well. So there's nitrogen, there's phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, hydrogen, oxygen, all those other elements that exist in very strong connection with each other. We know that most of the carbon in our soil is present through organic matter, which makes sense because most of it's derived from plants through photosynthesis and then the breakdown of that plant material into our organic matter. except for charcoal and carbonates, which are chemically very inert carbon in our soils. Soil organic matter, as I mentioned, can't exist with just carbon. We need to have the other nutrients in there as well. But we know that there's very strong and consistent ratios of those nutrients. An example of that is our carbon to nitrogen ratio, which is generally around 10 to 1. So 10 units of carbon for every 1 unit of nitrogen in our system. What's really important is that carbon in soil cannot exist without these other nutrients. The other thing that's interesting is that organic matter isn't the same all through the soil. If we drill down into really fine detail, we can see that there's a lot of different microstructures involved. And then the pretty colours on the right just show the different types of chemical function and form of carbon at different parts in that micro soil environment. So there's an incredibly kind of mix and mash, quite a heterogeneous mixture of different carbon-based compounds in our soil. Now, what's key, I mentioned that carbon can't exist without other nutrients. And this is shown in some really cool research that was done a number of years ago by a guy called Clive Kirkby at the CSIRO. And he showed that around the world, if you measure organic matter and soil, you'll see that there's if we look at total soil carbon on our y-axis and nitrogen on our x-axis down the bottom, we can see a really strong relationship between our soil carbon and our nitrogen. If one increases, the other increases with it. If we see at the next graph, the relationship with phosphorus is still there, but it's a bit more variable because of the chemical nature of phosphorus in our soils. But sulfur, again, a really strong relationship between carbon and sulfur in our soils. So this is all around supporting the fact that maintaining fertility of these key soil nutrients is the only way that we can maintain soil carbon levels. If we have low nutrition and fertility in our soils, we will have low carbon levels as well. Now, this is just something I'd like to work through just to explain why increasing soil carbon in agricultural systems is so hard. What we tend to forget is that carbon is actually a functioning part of our system, our soil system. The other thing that we know is that part of the breakdown of organic matter releases nutrients as well. So it's this release of nutrients that plants then take up. So just bear with me for a sec and we'll see if we can work through an example of how organic matter and soil carbon is part of the plant growth thing, whilst looking at maintaining that as a sustainable system. So first of all, let's talk through the fact that organic matter has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 10 to 1, which we talked about before. If we go out in the paddock and measure our soil carbon, and we have a carbon value of 1%, which we would say is on the lower end of where we should be on our systems, but it's a very simple number to start with, okay? So then that organic matter, through the cropping cycle, through that year, some of that organic matter is mineralized. So the microbes actually break the carbon away from that nitrogen and release it for plant growth. And the kind of forms that mineral nitrogen is in is what we call ammonium, which is NH4, or nitrate, which is NO3, okay? So we have, let's say, 100 kilograms of nitrogen released from organic matter for plant uptake. What we know is because of that consistent ratio approach is that will actually result in the loss of 1,000 kilograms of carbon into the atmosphere as CO2. And that's due to the microbes doing their thing of breaking down that organic matter and releasing that nitrogen. Because microbes breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, they will actually release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere as that nitrogen becomes available. Now, this actually is breaking down that organic matter. So if we don't replace that carbon and nitrogen, that organic matter bucket will continue to break down and deplete, and we will continue to have a reduction in our soil carbon values. Now, if we come back next year and measure that soil, do some soil sampling again in that same paddock, and we still have 1% carbon in that system, the first thing we could say is that I'm doing everything right, but my number's still the same. Why aren't I doing better? But then we think about it and say, well, since we last measured our soil carbon, we've released all this nitrogen for plant use, we've grown this great crop, we've harvested off 4 tonne of grain, for example, off that paddock, and we still have 1% carbon, okay? For that to happen, it means in addition to doing all that, we've actually brought in 1,000 kilos of carbon into the soil through stubble residues and root matter and that kind of thing. And we've brought in 100 kilos of nitrogen through either microbial nitrogen fixation or through some of the fertilizers and nutrients that we're applying. So if we start with 1% carbon and we do all those things and we grow all this food and we still have 1% carbon afterwards, that shows that we're actually maintaining a sustainable system. Okay, so we're doing all this stuff and we're maintaining our soil carbon levels. So the key message from this is that there's so much emphasis and talk about building carbon, whereas maintaining soil carbon values in a highly productive food and fibre system actually requires ongoing carbon and nitrogen inputs. It's a continually fluxing system that needs to be fed in itself. So if a farmer is actually maintaining soil carbon values, they're actually doing an amazing job. So what we sort of tend to forget is that carbon is in a continual state of flux. So organic matter is continually cycling. And most of the benefits that we get from organic matter and so from soil carbon is due to its decomposition processes. We like to think about soil carbon and organic matter as this black box, completely discrete. But in effect, what we're dealing with is this incredibly fast cycling system that's breathing in oxygen and breathing out CO2 and doing all these great things and being able to maintain our farming systems. So when we're thinking about soil carbon and how we manage that, we really need to look at managing our expectations around what's possible in our systems. Even just maintaining carbon takes the inputs and resources, as I've just mentioned. The other thing is that every system has threshold soil carbon numbers. As we can see on the graph, as we increase our soil carbon levels, as we increase our organic inputs, we actually have diminishing returns, which means we have to put more and more effort into trying to continue to go up the scale. The closer we get to those thresholds or that top of the curve, the less increase of soil carbon we get per unit input. And every input that we get into it costs money. We also know that different soil types have different ability to hold carbon. So our sandy soils can hold less carbon and organic matter compared to our clay-based soils. So even soil types are important. Our climate is important. As we get into climates with high rainfall, we also have high capacity to hold organic matter. The last thing to consider with this is that if we change our management to increase our soil carbon, that change needs to be maintained. So if we add an organic amendment, such as a manure or a compost to our soil, we need to continue to add that regularly. If we don't, our soil carbon values will decline back to where they were before we added that material. So everything needs to be considered well. The last thing I'd just like to come back to is that we really need to be looking at a productivity focus when it comes to soil carbon and organic matter in our systems. First of all, if we focus on identifying things that are stopping our plants from growing well, then we support optimal plant growth and nutrition and diversity where possible. Key thing about diversity is including a legume in the system, or a pulse, which is a legume plant that's growing for grain. Including that diversity gives our soils the best chance to function well. So that rotational aspect of including a legume with our cereals and our canola and everything else is super important. If we're supporting our optimal plant growth, then we're supporting high nutrient use efficiency and biomass and root production. If we're doing that, that gives us the best capacity to increase our productivity. If we've got effective use of our inputs, we've then got our increased chance of profitability. And knowing that all Australian farmers are operating on a world pricing level, that we have to be as competitive and as profitable as possible to continue to farm. So we're looking at using what we're putting in better to grow better things and to make it able to continue to do that. If we do all those things well, that gives us the greatest potential to maintain or increase our soil carbon levels. And if we do all that well, that gives us the greatest capacity to reduce or maintain our low greenhouse gas footprint in our system. So it all comes together from understanding how to grow things well, managing our inputs and resourcing, understanding what our capacity is to maintain and improve our soil carbon levels, and then being able to recognise when we're doing a really good job. If you're after more information on carbon, what I've talked about this afternoon, and other aspects of carbon in our agricultural systems, there's a link there that you can find out more. And finally, I'd like to thank you for spending this time with me, and I hope you've learnt something useful that you can carry on with. Thanks very much.